All right, let's jump into some history today. We're heading back to 10th century England, a time of kings and power struggles and, probably a lot less bathing than we're used to. And as you requested for this deep dive, I'll be Hari.
And I'm Kimi, and it's great to be here with you today as we explore the life and death of King Edward the Martyr, a figure whose name really just suggests, a story full of drama and intrigue.
Yeah, it really does, right? We've got some excerpts from the Wikipedia article, and you've brought in some super interesting sources. Edward's life, it seems, was packed with more twists and turns than, like a season finale of your favorite show. So our mission today is to go through all the historical details and try to separate fact from fiction and finally uncover, what we can about Edward's short reign, his very controversial death, and, really what it all meant for England.
Definitely. And I think we have to remember, that even Edward's rise to the throne had a bit of a power struggle itself, which kind of set the stage for all the drama that was going to unfold during his reign. Edward, the son of King Edgar, had a younger half-brother, Ethelred, who would eventually become King Ethelred the Unready, which that nickname kind of hints at some complications in the future.
The unready, yeah, that's definitely a story for another time, but just the fact that there are these two potential heirs, and each one had these powerful figures supporting their claim to the throne, you can already see this picture of a kingdom that's ready for conflict. Kind of reminds me of, those classic Shakespearean dramas full of ambition and betrayal and maybe just a little touch of over-the-top theatrics.
Well, the historical details certainly don't disappoint when it comes to that. Edward actually had some pretty prominent figures in his corner, like Dunstan, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, a major player in the church, and Ethelwine, he was a powerful nobleman. He was known as the Ealdorman of East Anglia, which basically meant that he was in charge of a large chunk of land and resources.
So not exactly people you'd want to mess with. But I'm guessing that Ethelred supporters weren't exactly pushovers either. So what kind of forces did he have backing his claim?
You're totally right. Ethelred had his own powerful allies, especially his mother, Queen Elfleth. According to historical accounts, she was, well, quite a formidable woman, and she had the support of Ethelwold, the Bishop of Winchester, another very influential figure within the church. So you can kind of see how this very quickly becomes this clash of strong personalities, these big ambitions. It's like a recipe for conflict from the very beginning.
Yeah, it really does sound like a battle of the Titans. But as history tells us, Edward came out on top and he took the crown. So the question is, what happens during his reign? Does he live up to that dramatic title of the martyr, or is there something more to that story?
That's where things get even more interesting, because we have to consider the context of Edward's reign. You see, his father, King Edgar, he was a huge supporter of something called monastic reform, which basically meant he was pushing the nobility to, give up lands to the monasteries, which wasn't a move that made him, let's just say, universally beloved among the aristocracy.
So I'm guessing when Edgar died, those nobles who had been, well, let's just say persuaded to give up their lands, probably saw this as an opportunity to get them back, right?
Exactly. And Edward, he kind of inherited all of this simmering resentment. And his short reign was marked by these nobles. They were reclaiming those lost possessions. And they did it sometimes through legal means, but very often it was through shows of force and intimidation. So while it wasn't like a full-blown war, there were definitely some tense power plays and a few skirmishes going on during Edward's time on the throne.
So it sounds like he kind of walked right into a hornet's nest, becoming king. And from what I've read, he also had this reputation for being, let's just say, less than saintly in his behavior. There are these accounts from Bertfirth, who was a monk writing about this period, and he kind of describes Edward as someone who instilled fear and even terror in those around him. He even talks about these cruel beatings. That's not exactly the image of like a gentle and pious king that you might think of with the title martyr.
And that's the paradox, right? This person who would become revered as, a saint actually had this reputation for a pretty fiery temper, even as a young man. So it makes you wonder, how that played into his eventual downfall and whether that contributed to the circumstances surrounding his death.
Which, of course, brings us to that, pivotal event in Edward's life, the thing that led to that name, the martyr, his death. And the Wikipedia article tells us it all happened at Corfe, which was an estate that belonged to, wait for it, his stepmother. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. It's like straight out of a Shakespearean tragedy or something.
Oh, it definitely has all the makings of a dramatic story. You've got the family rivalries, you've got the power struggles, and then this sudden violent end. The sources that we have are a bit vague on like the specific details, but we know that according to Bert Firth's account, Edward was visiting his stepmother, Elfrith, at Corfette, and he was, unexpectedly surrounded and attacked by these armed men. Sounds very much like a planned ambush to me.
Wait, hold on. So he's visiting his stepmother, the same woman who, like, actively supported his rival for the throne, and he just happens to get ambushed. It's hard not to see that as, well, a little bit convenient, don't you think?
Yeah, it definitely raises some eyebrows, and it's led to centuries of, speculation about what really went down that day at Corfette. The sources don't directly say who the killers were, but Bert Firth does mention this wicked plot among some of the nobles. And I think it's important to remember that in, medieval times, kings were considered sacrosanct. They were chosen by God to rule. So killing a king, that wasn't just a crime, it was like a sin of the highest order.
So you're saying even if Edward wasn't, exactly known for being, like, super saintly while he was alive, his murder would have still been a huge shock to England, both politically and religiously, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It would have been seen as like this massive offense against, God and the natural order of things. And as we'll see, the impact of Edward's death, well, it had these long-lasting consequences for England, and they extended way beyond his short time on the throne. It's also interesting that while our sources don't directly point the finger at Elfrith for, orchestrating Edward's murder, many later chroniclers and those who wrote about his life as a saint, well, they definitely paint her as the mastermind behind it all.
Oh, yeah, the classic evil stepmother story. It's a tale as old as time, right? But like you mentioned earlier, we have to be a little careful about reading too much into those later accounts. They were often written a long time after the actual events happened, and they could be influenced by political biases or maybe just the desire to tell a more exciting story.
Exactly. Historians still debate Elfreth's role in all of this. Some think she was, directly involved in the plot to kill Edward, while others think she was just a convenient scapegoat. It reminds us that history is often written by the victors, and we've got to approach those sources with, a little bit of a critical eye. But even beyond the question of who actually killed Edward, there's this question of, why? What was the motive behind the murder?
So was it simply a case of just trying to get, Ethelred on the throne? Or were there deeper, more complicated motives going on?
Well, some historians point to, that ongoing conflict between those powerful nobles we talked about earlier, those figures like Elfhere and Etheline, who were always, fighting for power and influence. Some suggest that maybe Elfhere saw Edward's removal as a way to, solidify his own position and gain an advantage in that power struggle that was going on.
This is starting to sound more and more like a real-life medieval Game of Thrones,
Yeah.
Alliances are constantly changing, and these different factions are all scheming to control the kingdom.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good analogy, and it highlights just how complex the political scene was that Edward was trying to navigate, right? He was stuck in the middle of all these power struggles, and maybe he was seen as a liability, too unpredictable or just unwilling to play the game the way these powerful nobles wanted him to. So regardless of what their motivations were, the impact of Edward's death, well, it was significant. There's no denying that. He quickly became a martyr, a symbol of the sanctity of kingship.
So even though he had that reputation for, a bit of a hot temper, he was still seen as being chosen by God to rule, and his murder was considered this, like, truly sacrilegious act.
Exactly. And it's such a fascinating example of how, people's perception of a ruler can change so dramatically after their death, especially when it's, a violent and seemingly unjust end. Edward's death was used by, both the church and later rulers to really reinforce that idea that kingship was ordained by God and to challenge the legitimacy of anyone who dared to, act against a king.
It's almost like they were able to take this tragedy and turn it into this really powerful political tool. But we also have to remember that Edward's death had some very real practical implications. His half-brother, Ethelred, well, he came to the throne, eventually earning the nickname Ethelred the Unready, which, doesn't exactly inspire confidence. So wouldn't you say that Edward's murder kind of cast this long shadow over Ethelred's reign?
Some historians argue that that's exactly what happened. After all, Ethelred came to power under, this cloud of suspicion. You've got all these rumors swirling around about his mother's, possible involvement in Edward's death. Not really the best way for a king to start off if he's trying to establish his authority.
Yeah, it must have been incredibly hard for him to solidify his position with that kind of baggage hanging over him. And then, of course, he had to deal with the aftermath of Edward's murder, the political instability, all the religious fervor surrounding it, and then you've got the escalating threat of those Viking raids. It's a lot.
You're right, and all of those factors definitely contributed to that perception of Ethelred as being unready, like he just wasn't equipped to handle the challenges facing England. But we also shouldn't forget that even though Edward's reign was, short and marked by all that conflict, he did leave a lasting impact on both, the political and the religious landscape of England.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. What specific examples can you give us of his, lasting influence?
Well, just think about the circumstances surrounding Edward's burial, for instance. So initially he was buried at Wareham, and it was without, any of the usual pomp and ceremony that you'd associate with a royal burial. But then almost a year later, his body was, it was exhumed and it was moved to Shaftesbury Abbey. And this time it was with like a ton of fanfare. And this whole thing, it was orchestrated by Elfir, that powerful nobleman we were talking about. And it was widely seen as both a way to atone for Edward's murder and also as a strategic move to clear the way for Ethelred's official coronation.
It seems like even in death, Edward's story was tied up in all the political maneuvering of those who were in power. It's fascinating to see how his legacy was shaped by those who came after him. And what about his, recognition as a saint? How did that develop over time?
Edward was actually recognized as a saint pretty quickly after his death, but the devotion around him really gained momentum as England started facing more and more threats from those Viking raids. And those raids, well, they were often seen as like a divine punishment for, Edward's murder, like this sin that needed to be atoned for. And so his image kind of became this rallying point for both, religious and patriotic sentiment.
It's incredible how a king who was known for his temper in life could become such a unifying symbol after his death. It really speaks to the power of martyrdom and how history can be, reinterpreted and reshaped to fit certain agendas. Even today, Edward the Martyr he's still remembered, and their church is dedicated to him. And his story just keeps captivating people centuries later.
It really is a testament to the power of storytelling, isn't it? Even if some of the details might have been, embellished a little over time, the core of Edward's story, this young king betrayed and murdered it just resonates with people on a much deeper level.
You're absolutely right. It's a story that grabs your attention, that pulls you in. And speaking of attention grabbing, did you know there was actually a bit of controversy in the 20th century surrounding Edward's remains?
Oh yeah, you're talking about that case with the disputed bones, right? It's a pretty curious story. There was this amateur historian who claimed that he'd found Edward's skeleton during an excavation at Shaftesbury Abbey. He even had, a forensic pathologist examine the bones, and they concluded that they belonged to a young man who had like injuries that were consistent with the descriptions of Edward's murder.
Yeah.
They even did carbon dating to confirm the age of the bones. So it seemed pretty convincing.
Yeah, that does sound like a pretty solid case. You'd think that would have settled the matter once and for all.
Well, not quite. Turns out there were some other experts who questioned those findings. Some of them argued that the bones actually belonged to an older individual and that the damage to the skeleton was probably, post-mortem. And to make things even more complicated, the bones ended up being given to a Russian Orthodox church after this big legal battle.
A Russian Orthodox church. That's a really interesting twist, especially considering Edward the Martyr's significance in English history. Just goes to show that even centuries later, his story can still stir up controversy and debate.
It just reminds us that history is rarely, neat and tidy, right? There are often multiple perspectives to consider, and there are unanswered questions and even, disagreements over physical evidence. And that's what makes it so fascinating to explore. It's about this constant search for truth, trying to put together those fragments from the past and understanding that some of the most interesting stories are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.
And in Edward's case, the questions definitely linger, don't they? Was he really a devout king who met a martyr's end? Or was he this young man with a bit of a temper who just got caught up in all this political scheming? Did his death ultimately make England weaker? Or did it somehow help to bring the nation together against those external threats, like those Viking raids that were becoming a bigger and bigger problem? These are all questions that we can think about as we reflect on the life and death of Edward the Martyr.
And as we reflect on all the different layers of his story, let's not forget about, the power of perception. It's amazing how a single historical figure can be seen in such different ways, even centuries after their death. And that's exactly why we, do these deep dives into these topics to uncover the complexities, the contradictions, and the mysteries that make history so captivating.
It's really fascinating, thinking about how a story like Edward's can still generate so much, well, debate and intrigue. Even after all this time, you've got these these conflicting accounts and whispers of conspiracies, and then you add in the whole mystery of those disputed bones. It's like trying to put together a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing.
Yeah, for sure. It really shows the challenges that historians face when they try to reconstruct the past, right? We're relying on these fragmented sources that were often written with a very specific purpose in mind, and we have to try to figure out what really happened, knowing that we may never actually have all the answers.
And it seems like with Edward, those questions are particularly, well, intriguing. Was he really a truly devout king who was martyred by those who were hungry for power, or was he, just a young man with a temper who got caught in the middle of all this political scheming? And did his death ultimately weaken England, or did it, somehow help unite the nation against those threats from outside, like the Viking raids that were becoming such a huge problem?
These are the kinds of questions that continue to fascinate historians, and they really challenge us to look beyond those simple narratives that often surround historical figures. And I think it's that very ambiguity, that lack of a clear resolution, that makes Edward's story so enduring.
It's a good reminder that history isn't always, black and white. There are a lot of shades of gray, and that's what makes it so interesting to explore and learn about. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Edward the Martyr, we want to encourage you, the listener, to think about these questions, to draw your own conclusions from the information that we've shared today.
We've traveled back in time together, we've explored that turbulent political landscape of 10th century England, and we've delved into the life and death of a king whose story still resonates with us centuries later.
We hope you've enjoyed this exploration and that you'll continue to dive deep into the mysteries and the complexities of the past. Until next time, farewell.